Welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica, and in today's video, I am bringing you another episode of True Crime Sunday. Now, this channel is primarily focused on makeup, but I've always been very intrigued by true crime, so I decided to start doing these videos about a year and a half ago. And initially, because I'm from the state of Oregon, I thought it would be interesting to kind of combine those two things and bring you cases from my home state. But as time has gone on, I also thought it would be interesting to include cases from all around the world. Now, when I first started this series, I was doing these videos once a month, but that's not always easy for me to do. So now I'm focusing on bringing you these videos at least once every other month. Now, this video is detailing the case of Robert Maudsley from the UK. And in the late 1970s, he brutally murdered 4 men. One man was before he was incarcerated. The other 3 men were murdered while he was incarcerated, either in a psychiatric hospital or in a prison. Now, there have been false reports that Robert is a cannibal and that he ate part of the brains of one of his victims. So the media in the UK has dubbed him the Hannibal Lecter of the UK and also the brain eater. Now, I'm going to be going into a lot more detail about these false reports as I give you the information about this case. But Robert Maudsley is actually the longest serving British prisoner in solitary confinement. He was placed into a plexiglass cell with a steel door that's in the basement of Wakefield Prison in the UK. He was placed there in 1983. And he's been there ever since. He spends 23 hours a day in this plexiglass cell, only has an hour a day to come out and spend some time in a very walled-in little yard, take a shower. And he's spent the last 41 years of his life in this situation. And also, I want to tell you that all 4 men that he murdered have some serious criminal backgrounds, 3 of which were allegedly pedophiles. So this is a very different case than what I have brought to you in the past. And honestly, I had never even heard of this case. One morning, I was in a video chat with Steph, not your basic Steph, my best friend and sister. And she said, you know what you should do? You should cover Robert Maudsley in one of your true crime videos. And I thought, well, who's that? I'd never even heard of him before. So I did go onto Amazon and I looked to see if I could find a book about him, because that's typically what I do. And I did find this book. This is Hannibal the Cannibal, Killer Crimes Series Volume 7, The True Story of Robert Maudsley, Hosting at the Monster Mansion by Alan R. Warren. And, you know, it's a smaller book, and there is some details about some other notorious criminals that are housed at Wakefield Prison, also known as Monster Mansion in the UK. But this book does a really good job of giving a lot of details about Robert's life, his past, his childhood, his crimes, and then also kind of what's going on with him now. I also watched a couple of documentaries about Robert Maudsley. I'll link those in the description box. I'll also provide the Amazon link to the book in my description box in case you're wanting more detail about this particular case. But I was very intrigued by this case and also have a lot of thoughts and feelings and opinions that I'll be sharing at the end of the video about a lot of different aspects of Robert, and also about the criminal justice system in the UK that I feel really failed him in a lot of ways. Of course, as with all of my other true crime videos, I want to give a huge disclaimer here. Viewer discretion is absolutely advised. I'll be detailing some very violent crimes, and I would not have young viewers around while you're watching or listening to this video. So without any further ado, let's get into the case of Robert Maudsley. Robert John Maudsley was born June 26, 1953 in Speke, Liverpool, England. Now, he was born into an extremely abusive and neglectful home. He had 2 older brothers, Paul and Kevin, and an older sister named Brenda. And basically from the time Robert was born, he was abused, neglected by both of his parents. George was his father's name, and he was either a lorry driver or a coalman. I've heard both reports, so I'm not sure exactly which one is the case. And then his mother, Jean, was basically a stay-at-home mom. And I don't really know exactly what was going on behind the scenes for George and Jean, but it just seemed like they were the worst possible choices for parents. And it just seemed like they just had a really tough time learning how to deal with parenthood. And when Robert was 6 months old, he, his two older brothers, and his older sister were actually removed from George and Jean's care and were taken to a Roman Catholic orphanage known as the Nazareth House, or also the Order of the Poor Sisters of the Nazarene. Now, here's also where some details get a little fuzzy, or I've heard a couple different stories here in terms of how they were treated at the orphanage. One of the interviews that I watched of Robert, and also in part of the book that I read, he talks about the fact that he was treated very well by the nuns there, that they were loved and watched over, and just had a much better life in the orphanage. But then I've also heard reports that that orphanage was absolutely horrible in terms of its abuse of the kids that were living there, neglect, just a horrible living environment. So I don't really know which one is true, but nonetheless, Robert and his siblings became extremely close to each other while they were living at the Nazareth House. It's like they grew to really love each other, depend on each other. Like they were like the only real consistent people that they had in each other's lives. And of course they were all, family. So the 9 years that they lived at Nazareth House really brought them together as a family unit. But when Robert was around 9-10 years old, his parents took them back, all four siblings. And when they moved back into the family home, George and Jean had had 8 more children. So now Robert is one of 12 children. Can you imagine? You're living in an orphanage for 9 years. You know that you have parents because George and Jean would every so often go and visit them. But still, George and Jean were pretty much strangers to Robert and his siblings. I mean, like I said, they very rarely saw their parents. And so now here they move home, and there's 8 other siblings that they have to get assimilated with. And unfortunately, the abuse just started right back up again. Robert reported that instantly when he and his siblings moved back into the home, they were being horribly physically abused. They were being hit with sticks, with rods, with George's fists. At one point, George actually broke a .22 rifle over Robert's back. He was beating him so viciously with this rifle that it broke in half. He also said that George primarily focused his abuse on the boys of the family, and for whatever reason, Robert was commonly the brunt of the abuse. At one point, he said that his father locked him in a room for 6 months, that was a pretty common punishment for he and his brothers. They'd get locked into a room. But Robert was kept there the longest, 6 months. And George would come into this bedroom 4 to 6 times a day and beat Robert viciously. Robert also detailed some very violent sexual abuse that his father did to him, sodomized him just viciously. And after a year of living in the home, Robert was once again taken out of his parents' care and was put into the foster care system, and basically bounced around from foster home to foster home until he was about 16 years old and was finally able to just kind of strike out on his own, which he did. Initially, when he left the foster care system, he just kind of bounced around the country of England. This was like the late 1960s, and there was a lot to do and see, and he just kind of was a free spirit for a while, but then eventually settled in London. Now here he is in London. He's alone. He's young. He's been horribly abused. He has absolutely no support, no one to help him, no one to call and say, hey, I'm hungry or I'm tired. Can I come and crash at your house? And he had nobody really. So unfortunately, he turned to sex work and became what is known as a rent boy in the seedier parts of London. And he also became extremely addicted to drugs. And those two things kind of just went hand in hand. He would need money for drugs, so then he would solicit himself sexually to other men to get money in order to pay for his drug habit. And another real key component here during this time of Robert's life, when he settled in London and had developed this horrendous drug habit and was engaging in sex work in order to fund his drug habit, is he's underage. He's not even 18 yet. And that's really what a rent boy is an underage male prostitute. And so older men were commonly seeking his services and were horribly sexually assaulting him. So here we have Robert, who experienced this horrible, horrendous abuse at the hands of his father growing up, was basically just kicked into the foster care system and then spit out. And now he's underage, living alone, no one to turn to. And again, he's enduring this horrible abuse by older men. And I think obviously that's a lot of what spurred on his drug addiction, was just to be able to cope with this horrendous abuse that he was continually suffering. And he developed a very severe, very strong, I guess I would say, hatred and rage towards these abusive older men. Not only that, but the majority of these older men who were sexually assaulting him were just full-blown pedophiles. And so that also instilled this strong, deep-seated hatred and rage towards male pedophiles as well. And also during this time of Robert's life, his mental health was really suffering. And there were several times actually that he was admitted to psychiatric hospitals. He'd stay there for a little while and then just get kicked right back out onto the street. During these stays at the psychiatric hospitals, it was noted that he was suffering from auditory hallucinations and that he was suspected of having either schizophrenia or some kind of schizoaffective disorder. And they weren't really sure if that was some kind of like genetic disorder or possibly a result of his very serious drug habit. He also on several occasions had attempted to take his own life, but there was just no real help given to him. And he would beg for help. He would be admitted into these psychiatric hospitals and beg to be helped. And it was like nobody took him seriously. They just kick him right back out onto the street. And at age 21 in 1974, this is when Robert commits his first heinous murder. Now, he was picked up by 30-year-old John Farrell, obviously for his sexual services as a sex worker. And John takes Robert to his apartment. And this is where the story gets a little convoluted. There's a couple different versions of this story that have been told, one in the media and one by Robert himself. Now, the story that was reported in the media is that John, of course, picks Robert up, takes him back to his apartment. They engage in some drug use together. And before they're getting ready to engage in their sexual interlude, John goes and gets a photo album and shows it to Robert in the hopes that this will turn him on. And it's full of child pornography, basically. These young boys in various states of undress, different sexual positions. And because Robert has this intense anger and hatred towards pedophiles, he basically just snaps and strangles and stabs John Farrell to death. Now, Robert's story, when he calls the police and basically turns himself in for murdering John Farrell, is that, yes, John did solicit his sexual services, took Robert back to John's apartment, that they had engaged in sexual activity, they had engaged in drug use together, and that over the course of the time that they were together, Robert just kept seeing his parents in John Farrell. And that's really what made him snap and kill him, stab him and strangle him to death. And that it's like he just wanted to see the pain that had been inflicted on Robert. He wanted to see that be inflicted on John. So I don't really know what the actual truth is here, but I'm more inclined to believe Robert. I mean, he did confess to the murder. And there really isn't any concrete proof that John Farrell is a pedophile. But like I said, that is what was released to the media. And of course, Robert is arrested and charged with the murder of John Farrell. And when the court proceedings start, he's actually seen as not fit to stand trial due to his severe mental health issues. And rather than being sentenced to prison, they sentence him to time at the Broadmoor Hospital, which is a high security psychiatric hospital that is known to house the very criminally insane. Now, 3 years into his stay at Broadmoor Hospital is when Robert commits his next heinous murder in 1977. Now, this is another aspect of Robert's criminal history that's under a little bit of debate here. And kind of, I'm going to give you kind of some strange details. So initially, Robert befriends an inmate by the name of David Francis, who is a convicted known pedophile. And he and David Francis start kind of taunting another inmate. Robert kind of takes David Francis under his wing. But shortly thereafter, Robert then befriends another inmate by the name of David Cheeseman, and he and David Cheeseman start harassing David Francis, this known convicted pedophile, to the point where eventually Robert and David Cheeseman lure David Francis into their cell and barricade the door shut, and then for a total of 9 hours, torture David Francis to death. Now, the guard shack is basically like, it would seem like right across the hall from this cell that they have barricaded shut. And I realize this is in the late 70s here, but the guards claimed that they could not get into the cell to remove David Francis. So for 9 hours, they beat David Francis viciously to the point where they're like cracking his head into the wall over and over and over again. And at one point, actually, Robert Maudsley holds up David Francis's dead body in front of like this little peephole window in the door so that the guards can see this, like taunting the guards almost. And eventually, after they have been successful in murdering David Francis, Robert Maudsley opens up the cell door and they go in, the guards go in to remove David Francis, and he's missing like the majority of his skin, and his head has been cracked open like an egg. And there was reports that were given to the media that there was actually a spoon in David Francis's head and that some of his brain material was missing and it had been eaten by Robert Maudsley. Now that is not true. Robert did take a plastic spoon that he had fashioned into a shank and he had pushed that into David Francis's ear, but none of David Francis's brain matter was missing. Robert Maudsley did not cannibalize David Francis. So at this point, of course, they arrest him, they charge him with the murder of David Francis, and the court proceedings start. But at this point, he's not seen as insane or unfit to stand trial. He's seen as totally sane and goes to trial for this murder and is convicted and sentenced to life, not at the hospital, but at Wakefield Prison, which is a notorious prison for housing some of the most dangerous and violent criminals in the UK. So of course he's transported to Wakefield Prison, and in 1978 he commits 2 more violent, heinous murders. Now his first victim was 46-year-old Salney Darwood, who was actually serving a life sentence for murdering his wife. There was nothing in his past that suggests that he was a sexual abuser or a pedophile. Salney had started giving Robert Maudsley some French lessons. And one day when he enters into Robert's cell to give him his lesson, Robert just snaps and just starts beating him profusely, picking him up, swinging him around the cell, and bashing his head into the cell walls, very similar as to what he did to David Francis, effectively killing him and stuffing his dead body under his bunk, and then walking out and going and looking for his next victim. Now, I want to say that earlier that day, before he murders Salney Darwood, he had been walking around the prison telling anyone and everyone that would listen to him, inmates and guards alike, that his goal was to murder 7 inmates that day, and nobody took him seriously. Now, his next victim was 56-year-old William Roberts, who was a convicted sexual offender. He had horribly sexually assaulted a 7-year-old girl. And Robert just walks into his cell with this makeshift dagger, starts stabbing him and hacking away at his head with this dagger, ends up strangling him to death, and then calmly walks out of his cell with the makeshift dagger, goes into the guard station, sits down at the table, sets the dagger down on the table, and basically just says to the guards, be ready because tonight you're going to be too short for roll call. So effectively in 1979, he goes to trial for these 2 murders. And rather than being found criminally insane, rather than being removed from Wakefield Prison, it's also known as Monster Mansion, and maybe put back at Broadmoor Hospital or maybe a completely different psychiatric facility, no, he is found guilty of both of these murders, sentenced to life again at Wakefield Prison, and in 1983 is put into the plexiglass cell in the basement of Wakefield Prison. Now, let me describe this to you. It's 18 feet by 14 feet, and it's constructed of these thick panels of plexiglass. I believe they're called perspex. And the door that leads into the cell is a solid steel door that, of course, is kept locked at all times. And there's this slit in the, I think, the bottom of the door where they can pass food in and out to him. He does have a bed that has a concrete base. He has a toilet and a sink that are bolted into the floor. And he does have some furniture that's made out of pressed cardboard. And they just have to be really careful about what they allow him to have. Like, he can have some writing utensils, but nothing that has a lot of like pieces to it, because he could, take it apart and make a weapon out of it. He spends 23 hours a day in this cell and has, like I said, since 1983, for 41 years, he has been in solitary confinement. He has the longest history of solitary confinement in a British prison. They do let him out of his cell for 1 hour a day to shower, and then also they'll let him go and kind of walk around this little like high-walled area outside. I mean, it's just teeny tiny, but that's it. And again, I'm going to say this probably a couple more times. For 41 years, since 1983, this is how his life has been. He's now 71 years old. And I have watched a documentary that features his nephew. His nephew actually goes and visits him quite often. And he describes Robert as a very mild-mannered, very soft-spoken, very intelligent, very artistic, very mellow man. And his nephew even talks about the fact that Robert has asked for help multiple times and had asked for help multiple times. And all of those cries for help effectually fell on deaf ears. No one really stepped in, obviously, to intervene and help him. And I do think that in this case, we need to look at Robert's life from beginning until he committed his violent crimes. And I do think he obviously committed extremely violent, heinous crimes. And I don't think that he should just be let out. I do think that he should serve a life sentence. I think he should be behind bars, but I do not think he belongs in solitary confinement. And I don't think he should still be in and have spent the last 41 years of his life in solitary confinement. I have read a lot of reports about what happens to people mentally when they're kept in solitary confinement, and it is not good. It is awful. And, I was relating Robert's case to a lot of the other cases that I've covered in these videos, of course, here on my channel, and extremely different from the other cases that I've covered. Most of the men, the criminals I've covered, are out murdering multiple innocent people, women and children, and that's not the case with Robert. I don't excuse what he did, but I feel like, and this is hard for me to say, but I feel like maybe it's a little bit more understandable why he did what he did. He was really seeing his parents in the men that he murdered. And he was also seeing their crimes. And yes, there is some debate on whether or not all of the men that he murdered were sex offenders, pedophiles. I understand that. But there was just no proactivity here. It was all very reactive. And I just feel like they're doing the criminal justice system at the Wakefield prison is doing their damnedest to make an example out of Robert Maudsley. He's like the poster boy for, you know, if you behave this way, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to spend 41 years in this glass cell in the basement of Wakefield prison, monster mansion. And I just think, yuck, you know, he needs some help. And I really don't believe that he is at risk of murdering anyone. I don't. I really don't. After reading the book, after watching the documentaries that I watched and listening to his nephew talk, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm completely ridiculous here in what I'm saying, but I just don't think he is at risk. Not that he should be maybe not out in the general population in a prison, but I definitely think that enough time has elapsed that he's been in solitary confinement that it needs to end. And I don't know. I've even thought about like, who could I write a letter to? I don't think anybody would pay any attention to me. Who the hell am I? Oh man, I just wish that there was some kind of action that I could take to help him. Again, I will say this again. I understand that he is a violent criminal, and I understand that what he did, he took the life of 4 men. I just don't think it's on the same level as all of the other cases I've covered here on my channel. So I would love to know what you guys think of this case. And if you'd ever heard of this prior to me talking about it in this video. I had never heard of Robert Maudsley. This was very eye-opening for me. But I just really hope that at some point they can house him differently. I do think that at this point, it's time to let him have a different way of life than living in a plexiglass cell in the basement of a prison 23 hours a day for the last 41 years. I don't get it. I really don't get it. I will try to have another video up in the month of October, but it probably won't be up until November. We'll see. There's holidays coming up, so I'm not sure exactly when it'll be up, but I really do appreciate you guys taking time out of your days or evenings to sit down and watch these videos, because I know they're really hard to listen to. They're really hard to get through, but I truly, genuinely appreciate your time. And until I see you again, I hope you're taking very good care of yourself, staying safe, and I will see you soon.